Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Giving USA 2023, the latest trends in giving, a virtual forum on philanthropy presented by Campbell Company. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. At last count, we are expecting, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 participants to be with us today. So we're grateful for your time and attention and look forward to sharing the new report hot off the press with you today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we dig into the report itself, I want to share with everyone a few webinar best practices to make sure that we have a great experience together today in the virtual GoToMeeting room. First of all, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar, of course, that might be running on your computer at this time. You could also consider using a telephone to call into the webinar instead of using your computer speakers. And finally, if you experience any visual issues, please send us a chat or contact GoTo directly at 800-263-6317. Go ahead and just note that number, 1-800-263-6317, and we will also be monitoring the chat. Next slide, please. So I'm delighted to be with you today. My name is Kate Roosevelt. I'm co-president of Campbell Company, and I'm joined today with my colleague, Peter Fissinger, who in addition to being senior advisor at Campbell Company, is also the chair of the Giving Institute, an organization that you'll hear a little bit more about in just a minute. And later in the presentation today, we will introduce you to our three esteemed panelists and really look forward to hearing their insights and reflections on what this report means for all of us as we contemplate giving in the United States of America. Next slide, please. So what is Giving USA? Let's begin with a quick introduction. Giving USA is the longest running annual report on charitable giving in the United States. It was actually launched in the mid-1950s by an organization then known as the American Association of Fundraising Council, which we now know as the Giving Institute. The report is published by Giving USA Foundation, which is a public service of the Giving Institute. A little bit more about the Giving Institute. We are a trade association for member organizations that consult with and serve nonprofit organizations. The mission of Giving Institute is to actively champion thought leadership that empowers generosity. And the vision of Giving Institute is to develop extraordinary leaders who are dedicated to stimulating and amplifying generosity. I'm also pleased to share with you that early on, Giving Institute championed the development of widely accepted standards of professional conduct, which were recently updated to a set of ethical principles rooted in three values: community, excellence, and diversity and inclusion. Giving Institute currently stands at 70 members strong, and Campbell Company is a longtime proud member, and we're especially proud of the role that Peter has played as chair of the Giving Institute over the last 2 years. The Giving USA report is made possible by contributions from member firms, as well as foundations and other donors. And very importantly, it's researched and written by our partner, the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And as you'll hear as we walk through the data, it reports estimates for both sources of giving and amounts received by type of organization across the nonprofit landscape. And those estimates are revised in out years to give us a more accurate picture of giving as time goes on. Next slide, please. Going just a bit deeper on the report itself, Giving USA now captures more than 40 years worth of data on giving trends in the United States. In terms of how the report can inform your work, it includes insights on the numbers, so where contributions come from and where they go, the rates of change in giving for the last 2 years, trends in total giving as well by source and recipient type, and also how the economy is influencing giving. Next slide, please. So here we go. Let's start with the headline. After 2 record high years of giving in 2020 and 2021, the Giving USA report is telling us that giving in 2022 declined 3.4% in current dollars and 10.5% in inflation adjusted dollars to $499.3 billion. As you can imagine, we can attribute much of this decline to the volatility in the stock markets and the highest inflation rate we've seen in the United States in 40 years. As we'll see in a minute, there are noteworthy shifts in both sources and recipients of giving. On this slide, what you're seeing are the 4 sources of giving accounted for, and let me just pinpoint where we landed for 2022. Individuals continue to account for the majority of giving at 64%, or $319 billion. Foundations now account for 21% of giving, or $105 billion. Bequests at 9%, or $46.5 billion of giving in 2022. And corporate giving is now at 6%, or nearly $29.5 billion of the total. So we're going to go a little bit deeper now and look at, now that we've seen the source of contributions, take a look at recipient types. Where is the giving going? Next slide, please. So what I want to point out to you here, this pie chart may look very familiar to you, and interestingly, some of the pieces of the pie have changed in size, and the order or the ranking of giving has shifted as well. As we look at where the nearly $500 billion was given in 2022, I want to point your attention to an especially significant shift, which is that education dropped, giving to education dropped from number 2 to number 3. Giving to religion continues to top the list at 27%. Human services has climbed to the number 2 spot at 14%. Education, as I noted, has dropped to number 3 at 13%. Gifts to grant-making organizations, so this would include independent, community, and operating foundations, is 4th on the list at 11%. Giving to health and public society benefit also switched places in the ranking this year, with health at 10% of the total and giving to public society benefit organizations. Think about civil rights organizations and United Ways and other groups that work under the aegis of public society benefit, now at 9% of giving. Giving to international affairs is at 6%, and I'm going to put an asterisk there. So we have some interesting data to share with you when we look at this over a 2-year period. Arts and culture at 5%, environment and animals at 3%, and gifts made directly to individuals rounds out the list at 2% of total giving. Next slide, please. So as we walk through the next couple of slides, I just want to orient you to the color scheme here. The blue bars represent giving in current dollars in the 2020 to 2021 timeframe, and the red bars indicate giving in current dollars in the 2021-2022 timeframe. So that is the last year of giving, the most recent year of giving that the report is capturing. So I'm going to share both current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars with you as we go through the remainder of the report. And we're doing that this year to really underscore the significant impact that inflation has had on giving in the USA, in giving in the United States, and certainly in this year's report. So in addition to looking at the red and blue bars, I'm also going to be referencing the column on the far right of the slide, which is the cumulative changes over a 2-year period. Remember that we're coming off of 2 record high years in 2020 and 21 for giving in the United States. And so it's really important from our perspective to look at giving in 21 and 22 cumulatively. And we see there that total giving, when we look over that 2-year period in current dollars, increased 2.7%. We also see, and you will hear this theme consistently throughout the webinar today, that giving from individuals declined in current dollars, 1.2%. This includes itemized and non-itemized contributions, such as gifts of cash, securities, and property. We've also seen for the first time in probably ever a drop in giving by both small and large donors. And you may remember, if you've been following this report, that in recent years what we've seen is a drop in the number of donors, but the total giving going up. So this reality that we're seeing in this report of drop in giving from both small and large donors is something to take note of. At the same time, we're continuing to see a lot of activity in the mega gift category, and that giving totals nearly 5% of total giving this year at $14 billion. And of course, I think we all probably are aware that donor advised funds continue to grow at a rapid pace and are playing a significant role in how people engage with and support the organizations that they care about. Grant making by foundations grew by 14.4%, and that is significant, especially when we take into account Candid's most recent foundation giving forecast survey that showed that the vast majority of foundations reported an increase in giving, and really important to take note of another, I think, growing trend as we look at the data. Giving by bequest declined 3.4% in current dollars. Interestingly here, when we look at estates by their value, estates of $10 million or more accounted for over 50% of the total, 53.2% of the total specifically. But really interestingly, estates that are valued at less than $1 million accounted for more than a quarter of the bequest giving at 26%. So a good lesson for all of us to not take for granted just the wealth that exists in supporter bases and the wide range and diversity of our supporter bases. Giving by corporations, significant, grew 22.2%. This includes cash and in-kind contributions made through corporate giving programs and gifts and grants made by corporate foundations. And we'll talk a little bit later about the effect of the gross domestic product and the relationship between GDP and corporate pre-tax profits on giving, especially from the corporate sector. Finally, in inflation-adjusted terms, corporations and foundations reached the second highest level of giving on record in 2022. Next slide, please. Speaking of inflation-adjusted dollars, fasten your seatbelt. Here are the red and blue bars again, red being the most recent year, 2022, that the report captures, blue being the 21 year, and again, the far right column being the cumulative giving of those 2 years. The results here are certainly more sobering when we take into account the effect of inflation. And again, we all know that inflation has been at a 40-year high. Total cumulative giving over this 2-year period actually fell 9.2%. Giving from individuals is down more steeply when we account for inflation. Grant making by foundations is still in positive territory, but down from what we reported just a minute ago. Giving by bequest is down 14.6%, and giving by corporations, again, remember current dollars up 22.2%. Here, when adjusted for inflation, up 8.1%. So no doubt we are seeing inflation really affect the numbers and how people are interacting and expressing their giving behavior. When we turn the page, next slide please, and look at recipient organizations, a few things I want to highlight for you here. And again, I'm going to focus primarily on the 2-year trends on the far right. So if you're interested in the 1-year results, take a look at the red bars in particular to see what happened in 2022. So first of all, giving to religion increased 11.8%. This is very much, I think, in line with what we see happening in religion generally across the United States. 20% of respondents reporting that they are attending fewer services in person than they did before the pandemic, but also we're seeing greater virtual attendance in religious services since the pandemic. Even though giving to education declined in 2022, it had a big year in 21 and thus increased 17.8% over the 2-year period. Giving to human services was relatively flat in 2022, growing 6.5% over the 2-year period. We know that poverty relief organizations in particular have seen a decline in online revenue following what was a really dramatic increase in online giving to hunger and poverty relief organizations in 2020, largely due to the collective response to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Giving to foundations grew 15.7% over 2 years. You can see that public society benefit organizations fell by 7.2%. Again, online revenue down for public society benefit organizations. Online revenue also down for health organizations, even though total giving to health grew over that 2-year period by 20.3%. Giving to arts and culture experienced an enormous amount of growth in 2021 coming out of the pandemic, and increased more modestly in 2022 for a cumulative total of 28.2%. And giving to international affairs is up 29%. You can imagine that a lot of this is driven by disaster relief and international aid being directed to Ukraine following Russia's invasion of that country, and also relief efforts for the floods in Pakistan and other natural disasters across the world. Giving to environment and animals finally grew 8.3% cumulatively over that 2-year period, while it decreased in 2022. So again, fasten your seatbelts when we look at these numbers through the lens of inflation. Next slide, please. What we're seeing here, again, more muted and sobering results. What I want to point out for your benefit here is that each recipient type, except for 2, foundations and international affairs, experienced a decline in 2022, but 5 of the 9 sectors that are tracked are in positive territory when we look at the 2-year period. So I think of significant note here, again, religion, giving to religion down, giving to human services down, giving to public society benefit organizations down, but giving to education up, giving to foundations up, giving to health up when we look at the results, again, over a 2-year period. Giving to international affairs up 14.1% over that 2-year period. Environment and animals giving down 4.2%. So another interesting fact is that when we take inflation into account, only one subsector exceeded its previous high. So in summary, when we look at 5-year spans of giving, so back even further than the 2 years that we're reporting on here to you, we actually see that giving to all types of organizations in the 2018 to 2022 timeframe rose above giving in the 2013 to 2017 timeframe, except for giving to religion, which remained relatively flat. Nevertheless, of all the subsectors, religion continues to contribute or receive the highest total of donations, and did so over this previous 5-year period as well. So next slide, please. This shows you the trend of giving, total giving over a 40-year period. And this is in current dollars. What I want to show you, you'll see also in current dollars in the dotted line, inflation dollars and the vertical bars. The blue bars are meant to represent recession years. You can see that essentially over this 40-year period, giving has steadily increased or stayed flat, except for 4 years when, due to economic challenges, we saw a decline. And when we adjust that for inflation, the decline actually happened in 9 years since 1982. And the annualized rate of change when we factor in inflation, falls from a growth rate of 5.5% to 2.6%. So we can also see here what has happened since the end of the Great Recession in 2009. Inflation adjusted growth of 20.2% between 2013 and 2022. So take heart, all is not lost. Next slide, please. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a direct relationship between the economy and giving. GDP is one thing that we've tracked and measured over time. And we see here that this metric reached a 40-year high in 2020 of 2.3% and fell to 1.9% in 2022. What I want to point out to you is that as a percent of GDP, giving was below 2.2% for most of the 80s and the 90s, as you can see here, but rose to 2% or greater in the 2000s and has been steadily at 2% or more for all but 1 year between 2012 and 2021. But we certainly need to take note of the drop in 2022 to 1.9%. Next slide, please. Individual giving as a percentage of disposable personal income, certainly how people are feeling at home with their personal finances after all of their taxes have been paid, how they're judging their own personal sense of economic security has a direct effect in giving. And we can see here that adjusted for inflation, disposable personal income dropped 7.5% in 2022, and individual giving as a percent of disposable personal income dropped from 1.8% to 1.7% in 2022. And this is the lowest level on record since 1995. Next slide, please. Corporate giving as a percentage of pre-tax profits. So when we think about returning to this topic and the role of pre-tax profits, we do see a strong correlation over time. Corporate giving as a percentage of pre-tax profits reached its highest point in 1986 at 2%. And in 2020, this metric dropped to 0.9%. And this does, in this case, exclude giving from corporate foundations. Over the past 40 years, this metric has averaged 1.1%. Next slide, please. So when we think about all of this in the context of the just sort of general state of the nonprofit sector and activity in the marketplace for contributions and, competing for mind share as it relates to nonprofits, we know that the reality is that the number of nonprofit organizations continues to increase. And in fact, if we look at just the growth from 2013 to 2022, the size of the nonprofit marketplace, the number of organizations that are registered with the IRS has grown from just over 1 million organizations to nearly 1.5 million organizations. So we need to think about what this means in terms of, certainly how we're communicating with constituents, engaging with communities, and ultimately making the case, each of us, for why our organization is a great organization to invest in with a charitable gift. So that is a lot of information to throw at you in a relatively short period of time. We are going to encourage you at the close of our session today to purchase a subscription to the report, which encompasses not only this great report that comes out every June, but a series of other reports that are commissioned and issued throughout the year on all sorts of great topics like donor advised funds and general generational giving. So more on that to come. In the meantime, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Peter Fissinger, who will introduce our panelists and lead us through an engaging discussion on what we think this all means. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Kate. That was a great presentation and gives us an awful lot to think of. If I could ask our panelists to turn on their webcam so our guests can see you. What we want to do here is just dig in on this information through a dialogue with three really interesting panelists who have agreed to join us today, and we appreciate your involvement very much. Let me also say that as I ask questions to the panelists and they engage in dialogue, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat, and Kate is going to be curating questions, and when we get through some dialogue with the panelists, we're going to open it up for questions from our audience. So let me just start by introducing our three panelists. First, we have Jane Wales. Jane, I don't see you. Oh, excuse me. My panel on the side is blocking view of you. Jane is Vice President of the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of its program on philanthropy and social innovation. That program focuses on the nexus of active citizenry, a resilient society, a robust democracy, and it considers the central role of trust. Jane has extensive experience in both the philanthropic sector and the government service sector, and if you're interested in seeing all of that, just take a look at her LinkedIn background. Importantly here, Jane is co-chair of the Generosity Commission. This is a nonpartisan group of leaders from across the charitable sector committed to celebrating and supporting American spirit of generosity as expressed through, importantly, everyday giving, volunteering, and other forms of civic engagement. Really great to have you with us today, Jane. Thank you. Paul Bessire is the Chief Advancement Officer at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and probably one of the more experienced museum fundraisers in the country. The organization itself has three different museums that Paul might say a little bit about. He also has 25 years of experience in museums across the country, including the Brooklyn Museum, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Great to have you with us, Paul. Thank you so much. Tamara Michel Josserand is Vice President for Development at the University of Washington, which its last campaign exceeded $5 billion, I believe. So it's quite a significant fundraising operation. Tamara is an advancement executive with more than 30 years of success in philanthropic and nonprofit organizations with a focus in individual, corporate, foundation, and planned giving. She's also been a leader in creating dialogue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of the other educational institutions Tamara has been with include University of Redlands in California, University of Illinois at Chicago, the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, where when she was a major gift officer there, I remember this, she played a central role in soliciting one of the largest individual gifts ever made to that organization at that time. And we really appreciate having you with us today, Tamara. Thank you so much. I just want to start by asking each panelist to give maybe a little bit more about yourself, about the organization that you think people might be, that you serve, that you think people might be interested in, and how it relates to Giving USA data. And then I'd like to ask you to give sort of a 20,000-foot personal/professional reaction to the data. What struck you? How does it align with your professional experience, or perhaps not align with what happened in your organization last year? What else comes to mind? And I'm going alphabetically by first name here at first, so I'm going to start with you, Jane.
Well, thank you. I'm so used to, since my name starts with a W, I'm so used to being at the end of an alphabet. So thank you for going for first names. And thank you for the role in founding the Generosity Commission, which is what I'll speak to mostly, more than Aspen. You asked how the organization we represent relate to Giving USA data, and the answer is it was created in response to data that was shown year over year in Giving USA research, and you know, at that point the key data points were, number one, that 20 million giving households had dropped out of giving during a 6-year period soon after the global recession. But also that, and this was, I think, what was most striking. I should note that they stayed out even when the stock market rebounded. So consequential beyond even those 6 years. But the data I think that jumped out at people, and you'll still see this, is that year over year, more money is given, but by fewer givers. And that year over year, more hours are donated, but by fewer volunteers. And that sort of presented a couple of questions. When it came to the more money by fewer givers, that did reflect the concentration of wealth in our society and could largely be explained by that. But understanding why more hours were given by fewer volunteers was a harder question. And some of us kind of posed the question of if one data point told us about the concentration of wealth, could it be that the data point about volunteering suggests a corresponding concentration of agency, of that sense that you can make a difference, that what you do matters in our society? And if that is the case, we don't know that, but if that is the case, what would that mean for a system of self-governance that relies on an active citizenry? So you and others at the Giving Institute decided to stand up a commission to do a couple of things. And first was to better understand those trends. What's behind them? What do they mean? And second, to better understand their impact on the nonprofit sector. And then finally, to consider their impact or their reflection of society more broadly. So we've pursued that. We assembled a group of 17 social sector leaders. I get to co-chair it along with the CEO of Blackbaud, Mike Giannone. And the 17 other leaders are from throughout the social sector, ranging from the leader of the Salvation Army to the leader of Lever for Change, an offshoot of the MacArthur Foundation. So it's a large range of folks who come together under the sense that this is really important. Understanding these issues is more important. So first, and Peter, I'm sorry for calling you out so much, but it was your idea to emphasize research. And so we did commission academic research, some from Lilly School as well. We also did surveys and focus groups of everyday givers to ask them what inspires their giving, what gets in their way, and are there changes that could be introduced, innovations that could be introduced that would lower the barrier to giving. Second, we did all kinds of research. We're now moving into a phase, and that was over a 2-year period, I should say, a phase where everybody in this audience has a role to play. And that is to stress test our recommendations, because we have task forces that have put forth recommendations for changes in policy, in business practice, and in research, new research being undertaken. And so now that we have those recommendations being developed as we speak, we'll be turning to folks like those in your audience to say, are we headed in the right direction? Does this make sense? Is this a change that can be implemented? So first and foremost, to stress test and advise. And then secondly, to the extent that you find these findings of value, to stimulate conversation locally or through your organization to improve upon it and to kind of grow the interest in not just dollars, not just hours, but in people who are givers and who are volunteers, to grow the number of everyday donors because of the important role they play in our society.
Thanks so much. And Jane, we'll dig in on some of this stuff that you mentioned going forward. Paul, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your organization, and your big takeaway from the data presented by Kate a few minutes ago.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So the natural history museums that's in LA County include, as you mentioned, the Natural History Museum in Expo Park, the La Brea Tar Pits in Hancock Park, and also the William S. Hart Museum, which is in Santa Clarita, California. We're a public-private partnership with LA County. LA County provides nearly 40% of our budget. And the land and the building and the collections are owned by the county. But there also is a foundation, which is the Natural History Museum Foundation, of which there's a board. of trustees who are the primary governance and fiduciaries for the organization. That's our fundraising arm as well. And we're currently I'd say, one campaign we're full on, and we're planning for our next campaign in a quiet phase, working with Campbell Company. Our annual budget is $53 million. The first campaign, the one which we're nearing the end of, is for an expansion on our southeast corner of the Natural History Museum, which will allow us to pivot in that direction toward the new Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, which is opening across the street, and will allow new access to our collections, also provide a new theater for public programs. And we're also working on reimagining the La Brea Tar Pits, which is the world's most important site for Ice Age fossils, and tells an incredible story about climate change in the LA Basin and human interaction with that over the last 50,000 years. We're an institution that does not have a long history of philanthropy, having been a county institution for some time. We were actually founded as the Museum of Art, Science, and History in 1913. So before there was a LACMA or Peterson Museum, there was one museum, and it was the Natural History Museum. So we go back a long way, but we were a county institution, so we didn't really enter into the age of modern philanthropy until the 21st century. So we still have some growing to do in terms of building out our donor base and member base. But it's been super interesting for me to look at the Giving USA numbers over time, and having been in this role and worked in museums for, I guess it's really more like 30, 35 years. I had a father who was also in the profession, and I remember looking with him when I was even a teenager at the Giving USA numbers. So it's something I've been following for some time. And it's always encouraging to me, although there are ups and downs, obviously, given economic cycles and the world environment for philanthropy and the economics of it, to see that there tends to be steady growth. So if we take the long view of philanthropy in this country, we see lots of growth, and there's shifts, as Jane has been pointing out. And we see that, and I think we'll talk about that kind of on a more micro level as we go forward, but we see that at the Natural History Museum as well. And it's great to be here today, and I'm grateful for Campbell Company for organizing this webinar.
Sure, thank you. I didn't know you were a second generation fundraiser, as am I. I joined a committee on the Council of Advancement and Support of Education one time, and in the first committee meeting, they said, "When was your first conference with CASE that you attended?" I said, "I went to one when I was 11, because I went to one when my dad traveled to Denver for a CASE conference."
I went as a 24-year-old, so I can't break your record, Peter. So it was 11. You were out there in front of it.
Yeah, I don't know if I went to any sessions, but anyhow, Tamara, tell us just a little bit about University of Washington and importantly your reaction to the data, and then we'll dig in some more.
Thank you, Peter. So I'll say a little bit about the University of Washington. We are a Research One, Division I public institution, and UW has been consistently ranked among the best public and global universities in the world. We have an enrollment, we're a big university, we have an enrollment of roughly 60,000 students throughout our 3 campuses, with about 42,000 are undergraduate students, and the remaining 17,000 are graduate and professional degree students. Over my time in philanthropy, I'll say a tiny bit about myself. I've primarily worked with large institutions, but I've done also a lot of consulting and work with mid-size and smaller institutions of higher education and not-for-profits as well over the years. As we are firmly in the higher education post-secondary area, this Giving USA data has really been very helpful in terms of having the latest research on this giving data. It really helps inform our practice for appropriate benchmarking as well as for giving. And understanding the giving data helps make our impact possible. I would say it informs the research we do, the support we provide to students, as well as helps make our impact as a global institution possible. I'll give you my takeaways, my immediate takeaways from going through the data. As a senior fundraising professional, a few things stood out for me. Like Paul, I've been looking at this Giving USA data over the years. And so I've seen over the years that traditionally the education sector has constantly been the #2 beneficiary of philanthropic giving consistently behind religious organizations year in and year out. And so the first thing that struck me is this is no longer the case. The other thing that leapt out at me was that individual giving has decreased, and although overall giving has remained steady. And so I thought that was very interesting fact to note. It seemed to me that was consistent with my experience of seeing how popular the rise of donor-advised funds have been over the past several years. And so I've seen more and more donors in large organizations and small organizations engage in more donor-advised funds where they can allow, which allows our donors more flexibility and control over exactly how their gifts are used. And of course, the other thing that struck me was that the degree to which corporate and foundation giving is on the rise. I know we'll delve into that a little bit more, but those are like my big takeaways.
Thanks. We're going to dig into a lot of this. And what I want to do is, as we go forward, we have so much to cover. I want to try to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm going to ask you guys questions and see if you can respond in about a minute, and then ask the other two panelists if they have anything to add. So Jane, Generosity Commission is focused on everyday givers and volunteers. And we know that the long-term trend, as somebody mentioned, is that the number of donors has been dropping, volunteers have been dropping, but until this year, overall giving has gone up. And it's been, really due to large gifts. So at the risk of sounding controversial, tell me why that matters. Can't hear you. Check if you're on mute.
That's a legitimate question, particularly from somebody who leads a fundraising corporation, because you can argue, well, gee, the money's flowing, nonprofits are growing in their number. What's the problem? What's there to be unhappy about? And I'll refer you back to a word you used when you introduced the entire panel, and that was the word trust. At the core of a trusting society, at the core of a resilient society, is the engaged citizen. This is the everyday volunteer. This is or everyday giver. This is the person who puts coins in the collection plate, that joins the PTA, that responds to the blood drive, that mentors struggling youth. These are sort of individual members of our society who, by definition, are everyday givers and everyday volunteers. They build trust, they build community, and they build our capacity to self-govern. So we see these as everyday givers as essential actors in a robust democracy and a resilient society.
Thank you. So Paul and Tamara, in your organizations, surely you have seen the number of donors declining or see these trends while also trying to hit your year-end results and focus on major gifts. How do you balance this in a comprehensive program? Paul, if we could hear from you first, please.
Sure. We're not seeing, we're probably counter to this trend, I think, primarily because we've been in a kind of growth phase in terms of our fundraising activities over the last couple of years with multiple campaigns in place. I think that we continue to see potential in our member. We have seen our membership decline, but I think that was primarily because of the pandemic itself, and the fact that the museum, and this happened, I think, to other museums and other public institutions, is with shutdown, the membership, the annual membership, which is really tied to participating and involvement in the institution, would decline significantly, and we're climbing slowly out of that. But in terms of major gifts and annual fund, we're continuing to see growth in those areas. On the volunteer side as well, we saw that drop off, obviously, because of the pandemic, but we're seeing demand for volunteer at our organization go up. There are lots of people who still would like to participate in the everyday activity of the museum. So I think that we're fortunate in that we're bucking this particular trend for the time being anyway.
Great. That's good to hear. Tamara, I have little doubt the number of donors is declining over time in the higher ed that you've worked in, but you've been able to get great results. Now, as leading a significant organization, we know how important the broad-based donor is. Most large donors start as, modest donors. How do you balance that? Achieving your final results and the big gifts that you need, but also building for the future and encouraging people to give at any level that they can.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a wonderful question, Peter. I want to say that the giving that we noticed the trend declining in terms of individual donors was not surprising to us, given the current landscape. And I want to quote information we found in the latest Gallup poll survey from 2002 that showed more and more Americans are less confident in major U.S. institutions than they were a year ago, and the average confidence is reached record lows. And so I looked at a survey by American Association of American Universities in March of 2023 that found that most Americans perceive that their leading research universities are headed in the wrong direction. And that was really striking to me, as these findings were particularly consistent throughout all political parties. And so people thought that America's leading research institutions did not share their values. They believe that colleges and universities are for-profit organizations, and that universities overcharge for tuition. And, considering those sentiments, it's not surprising that people would choose to give to other sectors. And yet, more and more philanthropy in higher education and support of higher education is more important than ever before, because at the same time that this is happening, majority of our state legislatures are spending less on public colleges and universities in 2020 than they did in 2008. And the impact of when state funding decreases, it really hurts our students and the population that really depends, underserved populations that depend on student tuition because student tuition increases. So that makes higher education less accessible, especially to people who've been historically excluded. So investing in higher ed is just a major driver of economic growth. We know that for a fact. It creates prosperity and innovation in communities where our colleges and universities work. And as an example, I know at the University of Washington, our economic impact on the state of Washington exceeds $15 billion a year. And so as a public institution and a public investment, a university can really make a great impact on the economy, its people, and its future. And that can be said of higher education throughout the country and many, many other states.
You know, that's really interesting. I want to stick with you here, Tamara. The Chronicle of Philanthropy yesterday, in its article on Giving USA, suggested that because of all the complex things that we're talking about, confidence in higher education, cost of education, younger alums not necessarily giving to education, that this shift with education moving from second to third is a very major shift. I think there's another way of looking at it, frankly. Education tends to get very large gifts, and there weren't as many large gifts from individuals last year. And we're talking about a minor shift. It's 1% behind human service. And if you look at the 2-year results, education is up. And I think if you were to look at the 2-year results in the pie, it still would be the number 2 destination. So what do you think's happening here? Is this a major shift, or is this a blip because of the complicated economy we had last year and just discouraged major gifts to nonprofits across the board? Education gets a lot of those gifts, and so they had a double whammy drop. Tell me what you think's happening here.
Well, I certainly hope that it's a blip, but all of the things that I'm reading tells me that it may be a bit of a shift as people have a different understanding of the institutions that serve their communities and the role that these institutions play. And so it seems to be definitely quite reflective of people's views, changing views of higher education in general. In the past, as a young person, when I was a young person in the field, higher education was a very trusted field, and it was a place where people didn't question whether or not it was important to send their kids to school to get a 4-year degree. There was value in that proposition. And we're seeing more and more people beginning to question that. And so I think we need to play a greater role as advocates for our profession, for our field, for higher education, for post-secondary education, and make a stronger case for it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to turn over to you, Paul. The Giving USA results historically indicate that giving to arts and culture fluctuates with the economy to a very significant degree. We saw that in the Great Recession. We saw it in the pandemic. And then it really comes back strong when the economy improves. So we weren't surprised to see arts and culture decline at those times. And so it is recovering from challenges experienced during the pandemic. But we have this interesting result where real dollars are up, but not enough to counteract the 8% inflation. Tell us about your experience in the past year. How do these results reflect or not reflect your program's results, or what you're seeing in the arts and culture world?
So I'd say, Peter, that if we look at the natural history museums, and we're a bit of a hybrid because we're arts and culture, but we're also science and environment as well. So we don't fit neatly into the arts and cultural sector. I'd say that what we've seen is that our donors have been affected by the slide, the slide in stock market value over not until recently, but in that past year, 2022, where it did affect their ability to make gifts above and beyond their annual support. So we saw a significant number of donors continue their annual support, but scale back on campaign giving or major gift giving that was in addition to what they were doing annually with us. So it definitely had an impact on us, and that's what I've seen over time as well, especially in the arts sector, is that many donors are giving with disposable income that's linked to their investments. In particular, the demographic of donors that we have at the Natural History Museum, which tends to be 55, 60 plus, they are giving from their portfolios. and that determines their ability and capacity to give going forward. So we're hoping that given the change that the market has seen in the past couple of months, as it regains its highs, that there may be a comeback this year in terms of getting to the numbers where it does continue to increase. Whereas last year, even though the real numbers were not bad, we saw them we still could feel that affecting us.
Yeah, based on some research that Campbell Company funded in another study, what we found was that arts and culture giving is dominated by individuals who tend to be more educated than the general public, tend to have more wealth than the general public, and tend to live in large cities. And when the market's strong, they step forward and make really big gifts. And when the market weakens and it causes, widespread pain, they start thinking about people in need and sort of shift their giving. So I would have to imagine that drop in the S&P 500 played a real factor in your world last year.
Yeah, agreed. I think that there's a shift in priorities that happens at that point, and obviously a shift in a donor's overall capacity to give. And if they're looking at their portfolio and it is in decline, and then if there's uncertainty about where the economy is going, that's definitely going to impact us.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about individual giving, because it still drives the overall results. And if you were to look at the Giving USA results 40 years ago and compare it to 2022, you'd see the portion of individual giving dropping from about 85% to 67%, and that is really significant. But if you account for the rise of family foundations and donor-advised giving, and giving frankly by bequest, because that is individual giving, it suggests the influence of individual giving may not have changed very much at all. So individuals have more tools in different ways to give. How does this fit with your experience, Jane, based on your widespread research and involvement both with Generosity Commission and Aspen Institute? What are your thoughts on this dynamic?
Number one, I founded something called the Global Philanthropy Forum several years ago, almost 20 years ago now. And the increase in numbers of family foundations and DAFs could be felt there. And in fact, in our first conference, after our first conference of non-givers, 285 of them within a year and a half founded their own family foundation or established a donor advised fund. So very quickly, at that time, that was, the year 2000, something like that. That was a period which remains of great growth of those new tools. The other thing is, as you know, we supported research that by and large, so longitudinal research to see how trends in giving were affected by the nonprofit sector. But what we did do at the Generosity Commission is ask ourselves the question: Are we asking the right question when we ask people about their giving to a nonprofit, they're volunteering for a nonprofit? Is that the whole story? And the answer is we kept finding through our research and the testimony we received a great deal of kind of online direct giving, unmediated by nonprofits. Volunteerism taking the form of a mutual aid association where neighbors spontaneously get together to help out others. The GoFundMe kinds of numbers, they're extraordinarily high. What we don't know, because some of these are pretty traditional ways of giving. The good old days, we used to help our neighbors as well. And in the good old days, we gave directly to, our wayward nephew, of which I have many. This is part of traditional giving. So what we don't know is whether the direct giving, unmediated by nonprofits, has gone up, or it's just that we've finally started counting it. And I don't know, but there's a lot of it. And so the question is, what was the baseline? What did it look like pre-pandemic? We've been told that, as many as 6,000 mutual aid associations just popped up during the pandemic. We're very lucky because the Gates Foundation and the Mott Foundation cares about the answers to those questions. And Giving Tuesday and GoFundMe have been able to come up with has received substantial funding from both to build a data commons so that we can capture these data going forward. And so 10 years from now, we will know what those trends are. I do have to add something though, and that is, as exciting as it is to find that people find a way to give and volunteer even during a lockdown, we need to be aware of what an important role nonprofits play in our society. It's huge. I mean, the fact that, that Tamara, that people think that all universities are private, are private sector actors, don't even know that they're nonprofits. When you go to the hospital, do you really ask yourself, gee, what sector do I want to have serve me when I show up to the emergency room? So we don't, fully understand what enormous role nonprofits play in our lives. They're such an important part of our delivery, not only of services, but a sense of belonging. Seeing them fail would have a truly significant impact on our society as a whole. So while I love mutual aid, I love direct giving, I've done it myself. I also want to sound to applaud the nonprofit sector and hope that we can do all we can to keep it alive and thriving.
Yeah, thank you. So Tamara, in the really significant program that you run, would you say individuals are giving less, or would you say individuals are giving in different ways? And how does that impact how you lead the organization and its fundraising?
Well, it's that we have to focus a little bit more on our advocacy, as well as educating friends, alumni, and donors. So this education and advocacy work becomes more crucial as we work to raise awareness of the importance and value of higher education in Washington and in the world. And so at UW, our president, Dr. Anamari Kause, has been a very outspoken champion of making higher ed more accessible. And that includes a long-standing support of a program we started called the Husky Promise, which is a philanthropically supported fund that provides full tuition to eligible Washington students who otherwise couldn't afford a college education. And part of the work we do, the advocacy work, includes correcting misinformation as well. So approximately 66% of our undergraduates graduate with no known debt. And so those who borrow still graduate with less debt than the national average. And so I think more and more of our institutions have these numbers that they can share, and we have to make a stronger effort to share that information with the communities that we serve in order to advocate for ourselves and better educate people on the role that we play.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, I think when you and I talked about this last week, is it an individual who's giving? Is it a family foundation? Is it a donor advised fund? I think you told me that you actually structure your staff in a way around those entities. That sounded really interesting. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I'd also, what we've done is we have a, foundation and government program, which focuses on the traditional foundations. And we define that as usually being a foundation that has a board that includes not only family members, but other individuals, as well as professional staff who are involved with setting the guidelines and moving forward their giving program. And then on the individual side, DAFs or sometimes family offices. And a family office can kind of fall in both categories depending upon the individual and the family. But on the individual side, we are much more focused on the DAF, and we're seeing significant growth in that area in terms of DAFs being used as a giving vehicle, which there's some problematic aspects for that for museums, in that we often have membership programs or fundraising events. And as you know, there are non-tax deductible benefits that accrue to giving via DAFs. And we find that donors often are confused about how and if they can make a gift from a DAF in support of an event or a membership. So that's something that it becomes a complicating factor. It can be a helpful stewardship conversation as well. But at the same time, in our area, while we see it as a great opportunity, it also can be, create issues with how donors are giving. Because as you may know, donors sometimes, even though they set a DAF up, they may not understand all of the rules and regulations behind them. And they become frustrated with us when they can't give to support their membership or an event, rather than the federal government for having set up the actual regulatory structure around that. So we're seeing that as well.
So any other thoughts about, because it looked like you were going to say something before I posed this specific question to you about what you're seeing in the shifting world?
That was the piece that I was going to mention, actually, was the issue around donors and how they use their DAFs, and some confusion about what they can give to and what they can't give to.
Great, thank you. I have lots of other questions. I could go on for a really long time, but I thought, Kate, we should take a break here from my questions to the panelists and see if anything came from our audience that you would like to pose to the panelists.
Lots of good stuff, Peter, and thank you, Paul, Jane, and Tamara, for your really thoughtful insights. I don't really even know where to begin, but let me pull a couple of good questions forward here for the group. First of all, there's a question, and Jane, maybe this is a good one for you, but would welcome anyone's insights on this. The question comes from a participant by the name of Jermaine Williams. And Jermaine asked, how much traction are activities like the Initiative to Accelerate Charitable Giving getting with policymakers? Are we likely to see new rules for DAFs or higher spend requirements for endowed foundations?
You're on mute, Jane. There you go.
So this is a great question, because but what's interesting to me is the question only comes up amongst people who are deep in philanthropy. That it's inside baseball for many. When it comes to, and Paul will tell you, there's a swirl of conversations around DAFs in particular, and the sense that they can be used by folks to park their money and get the tax write-off immediately, even though the ultimate grants to nonprofits aren't yet happening. Two things about this. Number one, there's nothing wrong with spending some time learning about the issues you want to advance before you actually make a grant. So I'm a fan of many efforts to sort of spend some time thinking through what you want to do and how you can do so most effectively. And DAFs are not the only way, but I'm just saying pausing is not a terrible thing. Secondly, the concern has been that, or the advocacy has been by and large around putting the same requirements on DAFs that you put on a private foundation. It's sort of saying you need to be spending, there need to be grants made that are commensurate with 5% of your endowment. We may be offering a solution without a problem, in that as you look at DAFs and how they're being used, yes, they can be used to park money for a while, but they by and large aren't being used in that way, and that you see figures like 20% of giving happening overall. So it sounds like I've got a strong opinion on it. I actually don't. So anybody can argue with me, or I can argue the other side of this. I don't have a strong opinion, but I do think at this very moment, there's not a clear problem to be corrected.
You know, Kate, I met with a donor of a client recently, and it was a very interesting conversation. They and their partner had built up a very significant donor advised fund, and they told me that they give 6 figures annually, and leading up to retirement, not only did they give 6 figures annually, but they were building up their donor advised fund so that after they retired, they could continue to give 6 figures annually. I thought that was really interesting. That could be looked at as parking money. It could also be looked at as very careful planning to continue one's philanthropy when one's income drops after retirement.
Thank you. There's a question in here. A participant is interested in asking us to, or having us elaborate on how giving changes and its influence during recessions. So, I mean, there's certainly the data piece, you know, economic theory, et cetera. And we've got some people here that have probably lived through a number of recessions. So who might want to take a stab at teasing out a little bit further how giving changes and is influenced when our economy is experiencing a recession?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, Kate, because it's something that I've been thinking about at UW. We are beginning to focus a little bit more on our pipeline developing the pipeline, the base of donors, and this is something that I find is really important, especially during periods of stock market instability, which causes our much larger donors to become more conservative, a bit more conservative in their giving. And so what I've seen over the years is our top donors, the conversations don't become no, just not right now. And so with that, and the timing of charitable giving, particularly large gifts, are strongly influenced by the performance of the stock market. And so institutions of higher education frequently make asks at the end of the calendar year and at the end of the fiscal year. And I found some very interesting recent case data that suggests that it might be a good time to make your ask during periods when stock market indexes are actually on the rise. But in terms of the pipeline giving and expanding that base of giving, I found that that's been particularly something to think about in terms of growing a base of support that will increase over time, although it may not make a big difference at the beginning. It's especially important among younger donors and diverse background of donors.
Yeah, I might add to that too. We've been looking at this recently and thinking about it also, like Tamara, that you see this and you see different cycles come and go. And I think the one note for us is that if you're considering launching a major fundraising effort or campaign, you want to be careful about launching it in a period of when the market is either volatile or the general economy is not in a healthy place, because you may be doing your prep work, working on your pipeline, doing your planning work during these periods, but launching or moving into a public phase during a difficult economic period is not advisable. And we have and boards ask questions about that. And we're in the midst of that right now, where our board is asking questions. Is this the right time to go forward? And we might say, we believe it's the right time to move forward with planning, but we're not going to be launching the more public components of our campaign.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Paul. I have another kind of a policy-oriented question, which is a curiosity from one of our participants about whether anyone has looked yet at the relationship between the decline in the number of donors and the implementation of the not so new anymore, but the tax law in 2017. Jane, you're nodding. I'm sure you have some opinions about this, or maybe even some data to share, but any thoughts from anyone about what, if any, kind of a relationship we're seeing there between federal tax policy and the decline in the number of people participating in giving?
So this is one of my favorite questions because I don't know the answer. We have assumed, I mean, it seems logical that if you can't have the benefit of itemizing your gifts, that would reduce the number of gifts, or at least reduce the size of gifts. It seems to be inevitably true. It appears to be true, even from the data. But as you can see, I mean, giving is still growing in a large way. We have conducted in our surveys and focus groups, we're finding out that, and this is of everyday givers, these are not of people giving six figures or more. These are everyday givers, and they say in majorities, not just the pluralities, but in majorities, that tax policy has absolutely no influence on their giving. Now, what I suspect is the case is that, first of all, we give because we really care about that issue or organization or the people that are served by it. I mean, that trumps all other considerations, right? All the sort of practical considerations, like what does it do? What's the impact on your taxes? So that's the case. But if you are giving in smaller dollar figures, you're less likely to think in terms of tax consequences, and much more likely to just give because you care. And so we may find out that in the end, it doesn't have as much influence as we feared. But again, I do think it has influence over the size of the gift, but the fact of the gift, probably not as much as we feared, put it that way. But others will have the real data on this as opposed to focus group responses and surveys.
Thanks, Jane. Peter, how are we doing on time? I think we've got just a few minutes left together today. Do you want me to pull another question forward from the group?
Sure. I think we have time for one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, great. I think I might go to, there's a really great question here from a panelist that I think is on the minds of a lot of people working across the social sector, especially people who are working as community organizers. And Marilyn Salazar is asking us to reflect on what we would say to community organizers who find that foundation and government grant funding slowly takes the power away from communities affected by injustice, such as white supremacy, ableism, sexism, and imperialism, and grant the funds to nonprofits who have more quote unquote moderate views and may have a vested interest in keeping their organizations running rather than pushing for political social change and addressing systemic issues. That is probably a webinar. I know that is a webinar topic in and of itself, but I know it's something that a lot of us are thinking about. So any reflections or thoughts that folks would like to share on that would be appreciated.
I could add a couple of points, but then turn to Paul and Tamara. And that is that in the last 2 or 3 years, what you've seen is a real effort to shift the power to the communities, particularly given how many communities were really almost devastated by the impacts of the pandemic. What you saw was that of the major private foundations, a great number of them actually just made grants to community foundations saying, you're proximate to the issues, you're proximate to the pain. You decide what local organizations should be getting, and I mean should be supported. And there was just this vast, I mean, almost 50% increase in the giving by community foundations. At the same time, there was a rise in interest in communities that have been traditionally underserved or maybe even unnoticed by private philanthropy. And again, big rise in the amount of giving there. I think the real question, and then of course there's this move called trust-based philanthropy, in which you reduce the burden, the administrative burden on the grantee. So small and agile organizations are spending their time getting their work done rather than developing reports and proposals. So I think the big question will be, will this be a blip? And will those organizations that had been lifted then be expanded? So I think that's the question I hope can be answered, and as not a blip.
Okay, can you repeat what the question, the actual question was?
Sure. So essentially the question is, what would we say to community organizers who find that foundation and government, I'm paraphrasing here just in the interest of time, but who find that foundation and government support slowly takes the power away from communities that are affected by injustice, such as white supremacy, ableism, sexism, imperialism, and instead grant the money to nonprofit organizations with moderate views that might have a vested interest in, quote unquote, staying in business, right, and supporting the status quo?
Well, I might suggest two areas for consideration for those organizations. And the first is something we saw from the Giving USA data, with this huge increase in giving from corporations. We're seeing more and more corporations and corporate foundations beginning to take an active interest in the communities that they serve, and in communities holding them accountable to being good corporate citizens of those communities. And so I see that going hand in hand with community engagement as we see the rise in interest on the part of corporations, how they are serving communities, and how they are investing in those communities. So that's something I would pursue. And the other thing is volunteerism. You know, this is something that's a deep investment in an organization, and our volunteers have a close relationship to giving in those organizations. Over time, they become great partners, and we see the strong relationship between philanthropy and volunteers. And so as a grassroots organization, I would definitely invest in trying to engage more volunteers in service to my organization. Mm-hmm.
And I'll be real quick, Kate. We see the same thing that Tamara has been seeing, which is corporations really looking to invest in their local communities. Mm-hmm. And I would advise in thinking about this is, you know, as we have done, is we're doing a lot of what we call co-curating or co-organizing with the community. So we are very focused on hyper-local. And I think you'll see a response from foundations, corporations, and individuals who are interested in that. As you know, even as a large organization that has a budget over 50 million, not super large, but reaches over 1 million people a year, and has a global importance. We're also very much focused on South Los Angeles and working with our community partners. And I think demonstrating that is the most important strategy, and mission, and obviously it needs to be connected to mission too. So that's what I advise. Oops, we lost Peter.
Thank you. Peter, I think your video, I hope you're still there.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, but we can't see you.
Yeah.
Well, I can see myself on the screen, but I just got a message that my connection connection to the GoToWebinar was severed. But anyway, we're pretty much done here. And what I'd like to do is just have a rapid fire, session, 15 to 20 seconds each, based on the time that we have left. What's the one thing you would take away from this and tell people to think about as they go forward in their fundraising activities? Jane, just one thing.
What you're going to hear from me is what you probably hear absolutely everywhere, and that is that relationships matter, and that all the pressure is on a fundraiser to concentrate on the biggest sources of wealth, right? If you have to raise $1 million, it'd be nice to do that from 4 people rather than 450 people. But in fact, this recognition that the small donor of today is the large donor of tomorrow.
Thank you. Paul, real quick, please.
Yeah, I'll reinforce that. Individuals and relationships, both of those are the way to go and where to focus.
Tamara?
I will continue to reinforce the theme and individual giving, especially younger donor giving. Research tells us that alumni and donors give more frequently once they are 11 years out from completing their studies in higher education. And the data suggests that engaging these recent alumni matters, even though their participation may not be monetary at first.
Great point. Kate, over to you to close us.
Well, I'm just going to end building on the individual giving and relationship theme, that if we are looking at how to inspire the everyday donor, and especially the donors of the future, we have to meet them where they are, which is on their devices. I was really struck by the number of Gen Z and millennial donors, 3/4 of them who were surveyed recently, that reported that they make all of their gifts not only online, but on their mobile devices. So if we are not figuring out how to meet people where they are and engage them in thoughtful ways with the technology and the communication tools that are available to us, somehow we got through this webinar without using the phrase chat GPT. How did that happen? That's, that, like, when this hits the ground, that's got to be on everybody's minds going forward. Thank you.